Boa tarde a todos. Estamos assistindo no stream também, que venhamos assistir futuramente nas gravações. Estamos aqui para mais um dia de atividades com o professor Julian Manley, da Universidade de Central Lancashire. É um especialista em muitas coisas, mas entre as quais em aplicações da psicologia social para o entendimento e compreensão das reações humanas à crise climática. O professor também tem familiaridade com a criação e implementação de técnicas de governança participatória para tentar lidar com a crise climática e as ligações regionais, notavelmente o modelo Preston. E ele vai falar hoje mais um pouco sobre o trabalho dentro dessa série de eventos que já se desenrola desde o início da semana. Então, professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here in the university in Campinas, Unicamp. Thank you for attending the lecture, and I hope we can have some interesting thoughts related to the climate emergency and a psychosocial perspective on the climate emergency. And the premise of the talk is really to try to understand if there are psychological and social and emotional ways of understanding the climate crisis, which may be usefully employed in putting us in a better position to tackle the difficulties that we face today and tomorrow. It's sometimes been described, the problem has sometimes been described as a communication gap. And this is one of the things that maybe a psychosocial approach can help us to understand what are the difficulties in communicating the climate emergency to everybody involved. And everybody means everybody. In a sense, we're directing our thoughts to our political leaders, to people who are able to take decisions that can change the course of things. But of course, the global climate emergency affects us all, and so we all need to communicate better among us to tackle this grave emergency. So I'd like to begin with discussing the fundamental question, or at least putting the fundamental question on the screen. And the fundamental question is something along these lines. Why, if 97 to 99% of scientists agree that climate change is created by humanity as a result of carbon emissions, why do nations, leaders, and populations continue to struggle to perceive the climate crisis for what it is? And why is action so slow in the face of such an emergency? And we have some quotations on the screen here from Turton 2021 that brings this kind of question to light and emphasizes the difficulty here. Despite, Turton says, the overwhelming evidence that it's still common to see politicians, media commentators, or social media users cast doubt on the role of humans in driving climate change. But this denialism is now almost non-existent among climate scientists, as a study released this month in 2021 confirms. US researchers examined the peer-reviewed literature and found more than 99% of climate scientists, so this is even more than the 97% that we've been used to hearing, 99% of climate scientists now endorse the evidence for human-induced climate change. So this is a very worrying statistic, because the immediate idea, the immediate thought that comes to mind is, if the experts, if the climate scientists believe that climate change is the result of human-induced effects, then why don't politicians and people act immediately to remedy the situation? And so the conclusion that this slide presents to us now is that maybe facts are not enough. Information and facts, even facts which are agreed by experts, by climate scientists, even if these facts are presented to us in this way, facts are not enough. And here are more facts. Current rates of global warming are unprecedented in more than 2,000 years, and temperatures now exceed the warmest period in more than 100,000 years. Global average surface temperature for the decade from 2011 to 20 was about 1.1 degrees centigrade higher than in 1850 to 1900. Each of the past 4 decades has been warmer than any preceding decade since 1850, when reliable weather observations began. And I think that this kind of demonstration of scientific fact, in theory, should encourage us to act. So the question is, why do we not act? A very recent article published just a few days ago by Dyke, Watson and Noor in the conversation says the following and presents some ideas as to why this might be the case. The trap of temperature targets, they say, they call the target of temperatures a trap, that target being 1.5 degrees, can be interpreted flexibly. And this flexibility in interpretation, 1.5, 1.7, 1.8, 2 degrees, is not working for us. And it's true that it's not working. We are a long way from achieving a rise in temperatures of 1.5 or below. We're heading directly for 2 degrees or more very quickly. And they say that this isn't working because the focus is not on the single most important concrete need. And the important need is not exactly to keep the temperature down. It's more concretely, more precisely, the elimination of fossil fuels and the change in livestock farming practices. So if we understand a target as being something along the lines of the elimination of fossil fuels, there's no argument about what needs to be done. Because existing targets are about temperatures, however, this permits the fantasy that temperatures can be reduced at a later date through technological innovation while continuing to exploit fossil fuels. And the kind of technological innovation that we're talking about, for example, is so-called carbon capture. The idea that through scientific invention, you can capture the carbon from the atmosphere and store it underground. So, if you believe that technological innovation in the future, such as carbon capture, can reduce temperatures in the future, then you're allowed to increase temperatures in the present because you know that in the future, technological innovation will help us to reduce those temperatures. So that's the fantasy that many people might have. The fantasy that you can increase fossil fuels, but also at the same time decrease the temperature. Now, if you look at this from a psychosocial perspective, psychosocial view of this problem would consider that the anxiety or distress associated to the realistic need for life and system change, the fear that this will equate to a decline in standards of living, creates a denial of reality and an imaginary, a fantastic faith in some idealized savior in the form of science, a savior that will save us with science, with technological innovation, before we die. And if you hold this view, the savior of science and technological innovation is all good, and attacks against the faith that this savior can save us is all bad. And this is one of the maybe the reasons that we're having so much difficulty in tackling problems of climate change. So it's still not enough. Unusually, for an article written from a science perspective, Dyke, Watson and Knorr hint at the effective and social changes required. They ask important science, but is anyone listening? Another fundamental question. There's a lot of science there. There's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of objective proof. But if nobody listens, then there's nothing that can be done. Then they go on to say what the change might be, and they come close to a suggestion of a radical system change, although this is framed as a question. So they ask the following question: would it be possible for participatory democracy approaches that could help birth the radical new politics needed for restructuring of our fossil fuel powered societies? So this is interesting because this is, if you like, a social and political suggested solution to the problem of the climate emergency, as opposed to a scientific, technocratic, engineering type solution. Nevertheless, even in their article, the concluding 4 suggestions for change that they make don't include necessary and substantial attention to social and systematic change. So the returning to the fundamental question and what it really means in a nutshell is communication the issue? And if communication is the issue, what can we do about it? So at first sight, there appears to be a gap in the communication between climate scientists on the one hand and politicians on the other. And if you improve the communication between the climate scientists and the politicians, then the problem would be solved. But what does improving communication really mean? And can it be achieved? Spockism. So, many of us will know who this character is from the Starship Enterprise, Spock. And Spock is only half human. And because he's half human, he has trouble in expressing emotions, in understanding emotions and feelings and affect. So Spock is famous in the series for speaking in terms of absolute rationality, absolute logic. And this attitude of complete logic, complete rationality, ignoring absolutely emotions and affect, that kind of attitude has been described by Paul Hoggett as Spockism. And it's an attitude possibly that we have in the communications of climate change, a communication that's based entirely or almost entirely on rational ideas and logical scientific conclusions, forgetting that maybe we don't all respond to pure logic. Just as when we watch Star Trek, we don't always respond to the logic of Spock. So Spockism, according to Hoggett, is a pre-psychological perspective that assumes predominance of the human being as a rational animal. And this, of course, is a direct inheritance of Cartesian approaches to knowledge. So if you remember, René Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am," not "I feel, therefore I am." And if you say "I think, and therefore I am," the human being is almost reduced to a thinking machine as opposed to a feeling being. So even as this perspective has been challenged, the challenge still comes from a positivist position, concentrating on behavior change according to the evidence and information provided, not according to how we feel about such things. That can be influenced and controlled. For example, you might encourage the change of behavior that encourages people to reduce the time they take for having a shower, for example, saving water, saving energy for hot water, and so on. So there's still the dominating sense that cognition, the way that we think, is as independent from emotions and complexity, needs an informing attitude. And information is not necessarily something that people accept without question. Even if that information is correct, even if that information comes from an expert, even if it's clear, even if it's without question, information is not necessarily accepted. Just like when we watch Star Trek and we listen to Spock speaking, we feel there's something missing. There's something missing in the way Spock sees the world. Sadly, we are more like this person than we are like Spock. This person is maybe an example of too much emotion, too much affect, no thinking, no rationality, no logic. This is a person who doesn't believe in the truth of logic, and argument, and objectivity, and expert opinion. For this person, he, in his feelings, is total affect, and he is his own expert. He knows everything because he feels it. And we are, in some respect, maybe not to this degree, but we are in some respect similar to Donald Trump. So we forget this, and we forget at our peril that much of humanity is very connected to emotional and psychological reactions, and that's why people vote for people like Donald Trump. They don't vote for him because he's very clear and informative and logical. They vote for him because they identify with his emotional attachment to aspects of the American way of life. So just as we might think it absurd to deny climate change, it's absurd to deny it because 99% of scientists tell us that we are responsible for climate change. So it's absurd. But just like it's absurd that we can deny climate change, we might wonder why a black person, for example, or a woman, why they would vote for Donald Trump. It doesn't make any sense. It's absurd. So there must be some other reason for this happening. Facts for these people and facts for Donald Trump are irrelevant. However, perceived emotional truths are very relevant. And Donald Trump and the people who follow Donald Trump are mostly concerned with emotional truths. If I feel it's true, it's true. Whether the information tells me otherwise doesn't matter. And is this not perhaps similar to some of the ways we feel about climate change? Oh yes, it's true, but I don't feel it. I don't want it. It makes me feel uncomfortable. It makes me feel sad. It makes me feel desperate. There's nothing I can do about it. Let's just carry on. And furthermore then, in this talk, I'd like to discuss the idea of multiplicity. The idea that there are many different aspects, both to climate change and to society. And within that, there are many multiple aspects of ourselves as individuals. We have many selves inside ourselves. And so when we think of climate change and when we think of the climate emergency, we mustn't imagine that there's one single issue at stake. And when we talk about how the individual reacts to climate change, we mustn't imagine that each individual will have one single way of thinking about climate change. We must remember, we must understand that climate change is incredibly complex. It has many, many different aspects attached to it. So even when we say we must keep fossil fuels in the ground, that's not the only thing we must do. We must do many other things. In fact, what we must do is change our whole relationship with ourselves, with other people, with nature, with the environment. We're talking about a transformation that moves us from individual simplicity to multiple complexity. So we can talk about the multiple emotional self and its relationship to climate psychology. And we can ask, how can we relate a multiple self to behavior change? So we have a quotation here again from Paul Hoggett, the person who talked about Spockism. And this is a rather good example of the multiplicity of reactions that are potentially available to us when we consider climate change. And some of us will think of some of these things and identify with some of these things, and other people will identify with other parts of this kind of thing, and other people will think of other things and feel other things that are not even here. But this gives you a good example of the complexity we're talking about. So, rather than a narrow focus on behavior, instead of a narrow focus on behavior, climate psychology is concerned with the many ways which we engage with climate change, the multiple ways we can engage with it, how we avoid climate change, how we deny it, how we embrace or accept it, dream about it, get depressed, terrified, or guilty about it, feel in two minds about it, think it's a sign of the second coming, or Homo sapiens' final and deserved comeuppance, ruminate about it, wake up at night because of it, can't get our head around it, feel that, well, maybe climate change is such a drag, it's such a bore, it's so tiring, it's not very interesting, maybe we don't want to think about it too much. Know that it is something one should worry about, even though one doesn't. Yes, I need to worry about it, but I don't want to. And so on, and so on. So all these different reactions may happen to the self at any time, all together, or one by one, or in combination with others, in a very complex and multiple fashion. And the complexity of it, the multiplicity of it, means that we can't take a simple and direct single action to change the way things happen. That's why changing a single aspect of someone's behavior is not a bad thing, but it won't solve the issue of the climate emergency. Another aspect that we need to think about when we talk about psychological thinking related to climate change is to try and get away from the accepted notion of the individual as being the predominant important part of ourselves. The individual is very much encouraged in the societies that we live in. The individual, and whether you or me or anyone else as an individual succeeds or fails, is discussed in terms of winners and losers. And what that does, of course, is that encourages each individual to compete against another individual to be the winner in the society that we currently have. However, we should understand, if we know anything about ourselves as individuals, that our self is made up of complex multiple identities and motivations, which can well be paradoxical. I can be both sad and happy at the same time. I can be sad about climate change, and maybe I can be happy that I'm so old that I'll die before climate change affects me. I can be sad and happy at the same time. Okay, and our face to the world is not necessarily the complete self, since other unconscious parts of the self are buried and repressed in the individual unconscious. So importantly, and often ignored in the positivist approach, our individual self is permeable with external dynamics and the social body. So relationships between ourselves and with the environment are realities. So we do need to move away from the idea that we exist absolutely as islands, as autonomous beings in ourselves, and that the boundary between us and the environment, the skin that covers us, the boundary is something that keeps us as individuals, because actually we are in absolute interconnectivity with everything that happens around us. Human beings, animals, plants, the environment, everything is in interconnectivity with everything else. So this idea goes against the way political structures are made, where we put an overemphasis on the individual, and we don't consider things in a more holistic fashion. But there is growing evidence in neuroscience as well, and in the way we interact with the internet or virtual reality. There's growing evidence that there are multiple extensions of the mind which are becoming more pronounced, and this is explained by the thinker and writer Andy Clark in this book and other books. In this case, 2011, the book Supersizing the Mind, and with multiple realities made available to all through enhanced connectivity to artificial intelligence and virtual realities, taking us away from any pure Spockist logic of the self-contained individual. The more we're able to connect with the outside world through virtual reality, through the World Wide Web, and through other ways of interconnecting, the mind becomes less and less obviously something within ourselves, but rather something which is in constant connection with other places. So in a sense, Donald Trump displays a natural feeling for virtual realities, in the sense that for Donald Trump, nothing is real. Anything is better than truth or facts. So these ways of being can be serious impediments to the logic of facts. At the same time, how facts and information are successfully communicated. So we need to understand all of these aspects of the multiple self, all of these aspects of connectivity between ourselves and the environment, all the multiple aspects of climate emergency. We need to understand and embrace them and face them in order to reach better, more successful communication of these multiple truths that go beyond simple, verifiable, objective items of information. So sometimes the opposite of intellectual thinking, of mental cognition, is sometimes described as affect, which is, if you like, a major way of combining different kinds of emotions. So we can consider affect and the unconscious as being something which is important and yet difficult to see, and we can put this against the idea of cognitive facts. And we can consider what is truth and what is a lie in these different kinds of contexts. So the fantasies we all harbour, but some more than others, are inextricably linked to this idea of the unconscious, the idea that we all have an inner world, and that inner world is often an emotional and affective world. What are the factual lies in the exterior world can be effective truths in the fantasies of the unconscious. And this says something about the difficulty of communication and the difficulty of verifiable and objective information. It's often the case, isn't it? And we all have examples of this in our lives. It's often the case that even if we encounter a lie in the exterior world, we can think it's the truth in our internal affective world and in the fantasies we have in our unconscious. So it's important, therefore, to reflect upon the meaning of the unconscious in the context of the psychosocial and climate psychology. Okay, we're moving on now to psychosocial understandings of the unconscious, or psychosocial understandings of the social unconscious, the idea that the unconscious resides maybe not only in the individual, but that the unconscious can be a shared or social unconscious, which many people harbour as a social body. So I'm going to now go through some of the very basic aspects of psychosocial thinking so that we can bear these in mind when we're considering things like communication and considering how people think and why they think. And in the back of our mind is the question, the fundamental question we posed at the beginning of the talk: why can we not accept and act upon the climate emergency, even if the facts are agreed by 99% of climate scientists? So the first aspect of psychosocial understanding is based on processes of projection and introjection. So an awareness of the internal self and its relationship to the external body, how the internal self can be projected outwards into the world, and how this world or another external world can be introjected and become part of the internal self. So standard scientific observation techniques assume I as a subject can view an object, and that the object is a truthful object, and that I am capable of viewing the truthful object. That's the assumption behind the scientific method. But if indeed we project things into the outside world, and if we introject things from the outside world into us, then it makes the purity of observation a very difficult thing to assess. So what we often project into the outside world are things we don't like. So if we have things inside us that we don't like, for example, I don't like the idea of climate change, it makes me feel uncomfortable, so I'm going to project my discomfort and I'm going to blame someone else for it. Because, for example, I have an electric car and my neighbour doesn't have an electric car, so I'm going to project the blame for climate change into my neighbour because my neighbour doesn't have an electric car, but I have an electric car. I project the blame and then I'm free of blame. So that's projection, okay? It's not a fact, it's an emotional projection. Another typical aspect of psychoanalysis, psychology, and the psychosocial is the idea of defense. So the individual is a social subject in the world of power relations and status hierarchies. And instead of rational subjects, we may often tend towards what Holloway and Jefferson call the defended subject. In other words, we as subjects, as living human beings who have complex, multiple realities and complex emotions, we are defending ourselves against attacks to feeling good. Anything that makes us feel bad, any unfortunate event in our life, any difficulty or trauma that we might have, we need to defend ourselves against being affected by it. And maybe the climate emergency is something we need to defend ourselves against. Instead of accepting the disaster of the climate emergency, instead of accepting, for example, that our children will suffer because of climate emergency, instead of accepting that, maybe I can deny it and then I don't have to worry about it. I defend my vulnerability in that sense. Connected to this is the idea of anxiety or distress. Anxiety and suffering become embodied. So anxiety and suffering affects us in the mind, but it affects us in the body as well. And sometimes anxiety makes us ill, physically ill, and it's projected, as we saw in the first slide of this series, projected into others, neighbors, children, partners, and so on. And the individual falls back on destructive defense mechanisms. It's acted out. So, for example, the individual might speak through their behavior, through, for example, violent behavior or racism and so on. So I might be, for example, anxious about my job, okay? I might be worried that I might lose my job. And then I'm very anxious. And then I'm even more anxious because if I lose my job, maybe I lose my house. And if I lose my house, maybe I lose my wife. And so the anxiety can build and build and build. And so what do I do with the anxiety? Maybe I can blame it on someone else. For example, maybe I can blame it on a black person, racism, okay? It's their fault because they're taking my job, okay? They're threatening to take my job. And I take my anxiety and I convert it into racism and I project it into, for example, a black person. So that would be an example, a sad example of how projection works to defend yourself against anxiety. And all of these things we can consider in terms of how we react to the climate emergency, how we react to climate change, how we reject the idea of working to improve the climate. Sometimes I ask myself, why are so many people opposed to wind turbines, for example? A wind turbine produces clean, renewable energy, so why don't people want it? I hear things like, for example, oh, the wind turbine destroys the scenery. I mean, compared to the climate emergency, maybe that's not an important thing. But we forget that someone might be in love with the scenery. I'm not saying that's a good reason. Maybe that's not a good reason. But it's a reason we have to consider. We can't ignore the affective reasons for the difficulties that we have in dealing with the climate emergency. Another aspect of the psychosocial is the idea of nesting, which is connected to complexity and the permeability, the way we are interconnected with everything. Nesting, like the nests of a bird, one in another. And in the next slide, I've used the example of the Russian doll to show or to exemplify how our multiple selves might be nested into each other. And deep inside, there's a small me that not many people see and not many people know, but maybe to me, that small me is a very important me. And maybe that small me is in my unconscious and is often hidden. And maybe in moments of trouble and anxiety, that small me can suddenly become a big me and cause problems, right? So we have to think about the small me, the bigger me, the even bigger me, the me that's presented to the world, the me that's hidden inside, and we might call this nesting, the nesting of complex worlds. And in this way of thinking, the individual is inextricably interlinked with different worlds. The micro intimate world, the mezzo, the world that's immediately within our reach but is not inside us, and the macro, everything else that surrounds us. All of which create opinions, thoughts, emotions, and feelings that interact in constant rhizomatic relational movement. So this nesting, in a way, the Russian doll example is not the best example, because the Russian doll example consists of rigid dolls, one inside the other, but actually the way the nesting interacts with itself is in a rhizomatic, interconnected fashion that is in constant movement, constantly changing, constantly moving. We're not fixed, we're constantly changing our ideas. And if you think of yourselves in your daily lives, one day you could be different to another day. One day you're in a good mood, another day you're in a bad mood, one day you're angry with someone, the next day you're happy, and so on. We're like that. We're not fixed beings, we're not robots, we're human beings. And so we're constantly in complex interrelationships, both with ourselves and with everything else. So, although we can artificially fragment these, like the Russian doll, we can take it apart, although we can fragment them, in reality, all of this is not possible to fragment. All of this is a complete holistic whole. So this simple diagram demonstrates the micro inside the mind which is connected to the body, of course, not the Cartesian mind, the mind and body, the social networks which are connected to the micro self, the social institutions, for example, this university, social institution that is connected with us, and the macro social order, societal order. And the splitting up of these categories, micro, mezzo, macro, like the Russian doll, small, bigger, 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 maybe it's useful for discussion, but we must always remember that it's a complex whole. It's not really different. When does the influence of the university, for example, as a social institution, when does that become part of the macro? When does it become part of the micro? It's not a fixed thing. So, another way of seeing it then, and a more realistic way, possibly a more complex way, is this way. And you know, this is how we are. I'm sorry. It would be great if we were simple, but we're not. We're a tangled mess of affective feelings and ideas. And as you can see, we might have within this tangled mess, for example, the item of the effects of climate change. Okay, we might have that. And we might say, oh, well, that's the most important thing. And that's why intellectually, cognitively, I'm going to write that down in red, because that's the important thing. But actually, if you're someone who has other worries, represented in the yellow here, the effects of climate change compared to, for example, if I'm dealing with the effects of poverty or if I'm dealing with the effects of a difficult relationship, or if I'm dealing with a disease I have, for example, I have cancer. If I'm dealing with something like that, my affective emphasis is on something else, not on the logical emphasis that I should be putting on the effects of climate change. And so we must remember that, and we must forgive people sometimes for taking another point of view. We need to be able to contain the difficulties that people have in order to enable and help people to face something else, which maybe for them is not naturally the most important thing, even though it really is. It really is, but maybe for that person it really isn't. And this is the kind of difficulty that we have when we're facing with this issue. So if we think about the origins of this way of thinking, we just need to think a little bit about ideas behind psychoanalysis. And concepts of the psychosocial, and concepts of the psychosocial leading to ideas of climate psychology, all have their origins in psychoanalysis. Now this picture here is a real picture of Sigmund Freud's real couch for patients. And if you visit London, you can visit Freud's house and you can see his couch. And this is the couch where many of Freud's patients lay back and spoke about their difficulties, their traumas, their repressions to Freud, who would sit behind the head of the patient so that the patient's eyes would not connect with Freud. And so the patient lying down, relaxed, would be able to speak freely because it's as if the patient is speaking to the air instead of directly to Freud. And this was Freud's technique. And remember, he invented this technique. I mean, it's a remarkable invention, even though this slide, it looks a bit exotic. Freud, of course, we must remember, considered himself to be a brain scientist. He didn't consider himself to be at all mystical. And so this is from a different time, a different era. But anyway, this is the beginning of understanding something which Freud brought to our attention, even though Freud talked about repression and Freud talked about the difficulties associated to people's mental lives. And even though Freud was concerned with the individual, not the social, what he did was bring out the idea of the unconscious. And I think that this is fundamental to understanding why we find it so difficult to change the way we're dealing with the climate emergency. It's logical to the mind, but our unconscious has difficulties with it. So that's the basic idea behind the psychosocial. Freud wrote a huge amount. This is my attempt to say what he wrote in about 13 or 14 books in one paragraph. If the feelings associated with traumatic events are too difficult to think about, these feelings are repressed. In other words, difficult feelings are kept inside you in the unconscious. You're not aware of them. They're inside, but you don't know that they're there. Maybe we have repressed feelings about climate change. If these repressed feelings are not dealt with, for example, through therapy, what is called often the talking cure, such feelings remain hidden in the unconscious. So the feelings stay in the unconscious. Or they suddenly come out in moments of anxiety. and they can be projected, as we've seen before, into others, into individuals or into systems. So, I mean, that's a sort of simple summary of Freudian thinking for you. This was developed by some thinkers into an object relations theory using the ideas of Freud and trying to see how those ideas could be connected with the social. So it concentrates on how relationships affect our way of understanding our relationship with the world. The object that we talk about is not just the object outside us, it's the imagined object that we have inside us. So the object that we see in any particular moment can be internalized inside ourselves, including feelings and experiences, and we retain from our relationship with a person. Our inner world is full of these object relations. So we have objects that are related inside us, inside our unconscious, and these play with the objects in the exterior world. So we might see something in the exterior world, we might see objects that are connected to each other in the external world, but these are connected to the objects we have inside us. And so we have difficulty in seeing objects externally which are not affected by the objects we have internally. So that's the idea behind object relations. So if the internalized object is unhealthy, this causes relational problems in the external world. So I mean, these early thinkers, they were very concerned with parents bringing up their children, especially the mother bringing up the child. And so a typical bad internal object would be if the mother had a bad relationship with the child would internalize the object of the mother, and then as an adult would have difficulty in relationships with women, for example, because the internal object says that women might behave like his bad mother, for example. It's impossible in this lecture to talk in depth about each of these thinkers, but if you're interested in understanding the origins of psychosocial thinking and the object theory of object relations, these are the principal thinkers. On the left, we have Don Winnicott, who was important in developing the idea and theory of the potential space, which we're going to talk about later. In the middle, we have Wilfred Bion, who developed a theory of group dynamics, trying to understand how people in a group can behave very differently according to how the group dynamics are established. So the group behaves in its own way, apart from individuals. And this is important. Almost philosophically, it's important because, as we said at the beginning of the talk, one of the issues related to dealing with or not dealing with climate change is the issue of how much emphasis should we put on the individual. Okay, so Wilfred Bion was important in emphasizing that we're not just individuals, we're psychodynamically interrelated in groups. And Manley Klein was someone that we're going to discuss in a minute, who developed theories of what she called the depressive position, which in fact is a healthy mental position, and the paranoid, schizoid or splitting position. So I'm going to talk briefly now about some of the important concepts that Melanie Klein developed. First of all, and importantly, she developed this idea of the paranoid schizoid position. And within the words paranoid schizoid, you have the idea of anxiety, and splitting, dividing things up into two. So the paranoid schizoid position, according to Klein, makes people think in an either-or fashion. It makes people split objects into part objects. So instead of an object being a unified whole, there are bits in the object which are good and bits which are bad. So things are split. They're not viewed holistically. In a paranoid schizoid position, there's an inability to relate to a combination, the multiplicity, the mixture of qualities, and therefore complex whole objects. And people who suffer from this kind of attitude or position often feel a sense of anxiety, a sense of threat, a sense of fear of attack, and a sense of persecution. So they often feel these things, and they're often arguing in terms of black and white, yes and no, good and bad, instead of trying to understand complexity. The characteristics then connected to those are a binary or polarized feeling and thinking, life and death, bad and good, black and white, love and hate, okay? And, you know, taking the example I mentioned before, something such as racism, for example, black people bad, white people good, you know? If you're not well in your mind, if you're in a paranoid schizoid position, if you're anxious, you project your negative anxiety into those people over there. It doesn't matter who they are, they're black people. That's the point. It's a simple splitting between good and bad. And love and hate, you could say it's the same thing. You hate them and you love yourself. And you love all the people who are like you. And that's why it's amazing that Donald Trump has some black people who follow him, because Donald Trump loves white people. And you know, it demonstrates the complexity of these things. People in paranoid schizoid position have no sense of a development in time. Things are either here or gone. There's no nuanced perspective on futures, past, presence. There's no thinking about the complex relationships in time. It's here or it's not here. They think about part objects, as we said before, not relations. They are anxious about persecution, and they are interested in retaliation, retribution, and revenge. Another aspect that Klein discussed was the idea of idealization. She talked about this in terms of the mother, the perfect mother, being idealized by the child. But you can see that idealization can be related to social conditions as well. So the idea of seeing and identifying with the idealized parts of the self in another. For example, you might have an intense identification with heroes and celebrities. These could be good, they could be bad. It doesn't matter if they're good or bad, the idealization process is the same. It could be Hitler, or it could be Gandhi. The point is, these people are idealized beyond the reality of their human self, and they become idealized objects. To you, it's true that Hitler is great or that Gandhi is great because of the way you feel inside you. You connect to that person, and then instead of seeing the reality of the person becomes an ideal beyond reality. Charismatic leaders, therefore, fascism or communism, it doesn't matter if it's Mao Zedong or Hitler, the psychological approach is similar. Okay. And another aspect of Melanie Klein, and this is a famous book, Love, Guilt and Reparation by Melanie Klein. Another important aspect is the cycle of guilt, reparation and gratitude. According to Melanie Klein, a depressive position, which is in fact a healthy mental state, not paranoid, schizoid, but depressive, healthy, consists of being able to move constantly from guilt to reparation to gratitude. Someone causes harm, someone feels guilty, a repairing process happens, and then gratitude is expressed. And then that cycle keeps continuing in the healthy person. Someone who feels guilty and is unable to repair the guilt is not in a healthy position. Someone who repairs the guilt but doesn't feel gratitude is not healthy. Someone who causes harm but doesn't feel guilty is unhealthy. And so this pattern of existence is identified by Melanie Klein as being a healthy pattern of existence and associated with what she called the depressive position. And the importance of this is the complexity of it, okay? In my own case, how am I going to deal with the guilt of flying to Brazil to talk about climate change? It's a very difficult situation because it's difficult to repair. If you remember, 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, the airline companies used to offer credits, carbon offset credits for people who were flying. So you could fly, you could feel guilty about your carbon emission, and then you could buy your carbon offsets so you would be repaired from your guilt. That doesn't exist anymore, so I don't know how to repair my guilt. Okay, so you can see how difficult all these things are. So coping with anxiety then, and what she called the healthy position, the depressive position, healthy thinking requires coping with anxiety, an observation that emerges from Kleinian thinking and which can be directly applied to the issue of climate anxiety. This is associated to Klein's depressive position, and these are, if you like, the healthy positions as opposed to the unhealthy positions of the paranoid schizoid, the splitting position. This is what a healthy person is about, according to Klein. A healthy person is ambivalent and accepts uncertainty. This person accepts the complexity of time, the past, the present, and the future. This person has an ability to experience loss and mourning. Many of my colleagues in the Climate Psychology Alliance accept the need to feel loss of the planet, of the environment, of things, animals that become extinct, of air that is pure, and so on. Many are able to feel the loss and are able to go through a grief or mourning process. That's a healthy process. But if you don't mourn your loss, then how do you deal with the loss? So how does someone deal with the loss of the environment, the loss of things in the planet? Well, what you can do is you can ignore it. You can deny that it's happening. So you can repress it, not deal with it. But if you deny it, if you repress it, if you hold it inside, then you're not facing the reality. So if you repress the feeling of loss for the environment, then you don't face an aspect of the climate emergency. So we have to understand that it's possible that instead of feeling loss and grief And instead of mourning in the face of the climate emergency, people are repressing the feeling of loss. And if they repress this feeling, then they can't deal with the fact of loss, because they are imagining there is no loss, because they can't cope with the loss. And so this is maybe another of the many reasons why it's difficult to accept the information related to climate change. Okay, so if in a sort of simple way, if the climate scientist says that we need to reduce livestock farming, the farming of animals for meat, by 30%, and if that is information which is factual information based on scientific knowledge, which it is, this is not something we are debating, it's a fact. We need to reduce our consumption of meat. For some people, maybe that's a horrible loss. The idea is I will become like that strange vegan person over there, and I'll become another person, and my friends will laugh at me because I'm not eating meat. I'm having my vegan dish and everyone else is having a meat dish. And you know, it sounds trivial, but actually this is the kind of simple triviality that makes the difference. Something which is trivial in compared to the need to reduce carbon emissions, the idea that you might feel embarrassed by not eating meat, for example, you might think, oh, that's silly. But actually, it might mean a lot to someone, and it might stop the information making a difference. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration. And of course, it's wrong to say to that person, don't be silly, come on, stop eating meat, because the reaction to that will be a conflict. And so how do you convey that information to that person in a way that that person will find it acceptable? That's the question. There's a perception of one's own destructiveness, okay? You accept with a healthy mind, you accept that you can cause harm to others. You're concerned with guilt, reparation, and gratitude. You have a capacity for empathy. Maybe that's connected with what I've just been saying. Can I be empathic with the person who insists on eating meat and as a result will encourage the farming of animals and as a result will encourage the increase of temperatures on the earth and as a result will encourage the destruction of the environment and damage my daughter? Can I feel empathy for that person? Okay, empathy. The ability connected to empathy to see the other's point of view and the acceptance of personal responsibility. It's easy psychologically to project things somewhere else. Instead of projecting, you need to accept and be responsible for these things. So I'd like to move on now to the idea of the social body. Remember, the social body as opposed to the individual body. So in this, what I consider to be fantastic work by Erich Fromm, called The Sane Society. Erich Fromm was psychoanalyst or psychoanalytically trained, and he was able to understand society as a social body and not as simply an accumulation of individuals. And therefore, he was able to talk about society in terms of sanity. So obviously, we normally talk about an individual being sane or not sane, and Eric Fromm expanded that to social sanity. And it reminds me a little bit of another great author, even greater author, Michel Foucault, who wrote this fantastic work, which I hope many of you have read, called Madness and Civilization, where civilization is questioned and sometimes equated with madness. It's very important to us facing the climate emergency because it's not difficult to say that as a society we are mad to not do anything about or do not enough to deal with the climate emergency. We are mad, we are crazy, okay? But we have to understand that it's possible for society to be mad, not just one or two people. So Fromm's analysis of a healthy society includes an attack of consumerism. So he thought that consumerism was unhealthy, and an encouragement to see an individual as part of social structures and move beyond individualism. It's a psychoanalytically informed view of political structures where mental health is equated with a certain way of living and also relevant to dealing with the climate emergency. And apart from the fact that this book is a very interesting read and highly recommended, I just want to point out the fact of its publication in 1955. And I just think it's amazing that this was written before I was even born, but if you read it, you can see that it's almost perfectly relevant to today, which is very worrying, because it makes you wonder, these ideas, they haven't been communicated, not properly. We haven't been informed by these ideas. So why not? Where are we going wrong? Maybe it's for similar reasons as today. Maybe, for example, we are so wedded emotionally and affectively to buying things, to associating our progress with consumerism, that we can't face the idea that actually that's a little bit like being mad. Okay? Whatever it is, it's very striking and actually a little bit depressing to feel that this could have been written in 1955. So, a concluding thought then, from the outside looking in. Understanding reactions to climate change and the apparent lack of action, the denial and disavowal associated with reactions to the climate emergency requires a completely different perspective to the narrowness of the logico-rational thinking that has until now been responsible for human progress. That in itself is a problem. We're not denying that science has advanced our way of living, our standard of living, because of the scientific method. We're not denying that. But what we're saying is that that's not enough to deal with the current crisis. As part of this transformation of thinking from the logico-rational thinking to a more holistic, multiple way of thinking, a more psychosocial and affective way of thinking, as part of this transformation of thinking, it's necessary to adopt holistic and body-social perspectives. The body that is me is inextricably part of the body social. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Perguntas aqui ou no online, podem fazer em qualquer língua que vocês queiram. O pessoal do online pode mandar por escrito.
Tem questão aí? Não? Tá. Julian, I would like to ask you about psychosocial approach because we have several kinds of societies, even in the present, not only in the past and present. So how to deal with this difference? Because when you think, for example, in a city of São Paulo, this unity as a kind or a part of the society with a lot of influence, but based in a very destructive way to life, completely linked to the industry, etc., or even the farming industry. So how to live with different, I think it's better to ask you how the psychosocial studies, meaning with different societies, above all, the difference of number of people in the society, because maybe that number has an impact in the communication of climate change, for example, or not. What do you think about it? It's clear because Vinicius can help us.
Okay, could you summarize your question in a single sentence?
Yes. How psychosocial studies works with different kinds of societies. For example, societies with different number of members. A little city and a big city, a Christian country and a Muslim country, a poor country or a rich country.
Yes, well, a psychosocial approach specifically addresses these questions. So instead of accepting that you, in your culture, whatever you are, if you are, for example, from Brazil, from a big city, an educated person, and if you're, a black person as well, then you have a certain knowledge and culture. But the whole point about not emphasizing the individual and emphasizing and celebrating difference and diversity, because difference and diversity are the constituent parts of the whole. So by respecting that and by empowering and giving agency to the different aspects of that whole, then you're encouraging a combination of attitudes which can enrich the conversation. And it's very important to reach common ground. So if any of the attitude that one adopts is too individualistic or too proud of itself, then it eliminates the possibility of authentic and transparent communication with others, and it encourages competition and conflict. So we have to understand, for example, how to contain different ideas. So containment is a technique, if you like, in psychoanalytical practice, where you allow divergent and different views to be expressed and not immediately contested, but to be expressed and to be held and to be contained, so that everybody feels they have an opportunity to express. And then, when the moment is right, those views, which might be views that are contradictory to your own views, but nevertheless, they're sincerely held views and they're views that have been expressed, at a certain moment, once everybody has the respect of being listened to through the containment of diversity, then it's possible to understand that those differing views may be in ways which are more fruitfully discussed as common ground. I'll give you an example. There's an example of someone I know who did an event bringing together Israeli Jews and Palestinians a long time before the events of today. These people were not happy to get together in a room, and these people felt that they had irreconcilable differences. And through the exercise that they did, which was connected to an exercise called social dreaming, they were able to understand that they feared each other, but they shared the same affect, which is fear. So, although the fear was of the other, the affective feeling of fear was one they could share. Connected to that, they all had children, and so they were able to share the common feeling that parents have with their children, feeling of love. And so, despite religious differences, despite differences of ethnicity, they were able to discover some common ground. And so it's very important to discover common ground, but you discover common ground by enabling listening and enabling containment, not by telling people what the common ground is, but by the common ground being established by the people who are assembled. And that's, I think, a difficult way, but a genuine way forward. And the big advantage of this is that at all times you avoid conflict and competition. At all times the focus is on the common ground, commonality. And there's nothing more important than that with the climate crisis. The idea that we are all global human beings is our common ground, literally the common planet, you know. So, you know, that's what I would suggest. I'm not saying this is easy, but I think that this is a particular way forward. And I think the words to remember are listening, common ground, containing, and cooperation. All of those things, and possibly the idea of empathy as well. Trying to be understanding and empathic with someone who is not like you. Does that answer the question, Joel? You gave me a difficult question.
Uma questão online? Mais alguma questão entre nós?
I'll try to speak in English if you have me great. You were saying about to be necessary to adopt a perspective more holistic. And do you think that are there societies that are closer to this model? A society that could be an example for us to help us to reach this model?
Yes, I do. I think I personally have a strong connection with the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque Country in the north of the Spanish Peninsula. So the Mondragon cooperatives consist of many individual cooperatives that are connected by a bigger cooperative called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. And these are cooperative businesses, they make money, but they govern themselves democratically. and the people who work in the cooperatives are members of the cooperative. They own the cooperative. And so there's very little hierarchy, and there's a lot of common decision-making and participation in governance and decision-making. And part of the profit of each cooperative goes back into the community. So they are a large group of people, 80,000, who deal with ideas and problems in a cooperative fashion, and who work towards retaining cooperative values and principles as being more important than financial and economic principles. And this is one of the things that would help us a lot with the climate emergency. And the motto of the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation is humanity at work. And I think that that is a nice motto. So it emphasizes the human aspect of our existence as opposed to working for money and profit. They make money, but the money goes to themselves and their families and their communities, and it goes to improving the social and community structures of the community. I'm not saying it's perfect. They have problems, but if you ask me the question, are there some communities that are closer than other communities? That's what I would say.
I don't know if it's something in the same way, but today I was very touched because from 5 days I am receiving in several groups of environmental activists notices about the situations on Pantanal and Amazonia, about the fires. And they are all the time asking for help because a lot of scientists and citizens, common citizens, linked to fire combat are there in that moment, and we are all very touched. I think it's a situation very stressing and very complicated, but it's a moment where we are feeling very closely these activists, scientists and non-scientists that are there. And I think it's mobilizing other peoples that are not really in front, but in other years, they will be there, I think so. Ficou claro?
I think it's true that there are sometimes inspirational moments which give you hope that we might be able to act. I think that one of the issues of climate change is that it's a macro complex issue. And so we have to find a way to act on a macro scale. And this is a problem. This is a problem. Because even if I do good things, or even if a group of people do good things, or even if the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, 80,000 people do good things, it's not enough. It has to be much greater than that. And I think that this is a unique problem, which is why we need to be transformative in the way that we do things. And sometimes you have to be careful, because sometimes by being very satisfied with yourself, or by being very pleased with a group, you can feel, oh, I've done what I can. And then you stop doing what you must do, which is to go to the greater question. Okay, so for example, I've mentioned this before, but I think it's important. as an individual, if I'm the perfect green ecological individual, everything I do is perfect. I'm a vegan, I don't drive, I don't fly, you know, I don't buy any plastic, you know, I don't pollute the air at all. I only have renewables, you know, I'm the perfect ecological person. And the real effect of what I do, even if I'm perfect, is almost nothing. That's the truth. But I might feel to myself, I'm so perfect, I'm not going to even think about the problem anymore. I've done what I can. It's not my problem. See, so being perfect is not the answer either. We have to work together on a macro scale. Being perfect can even be negative in that way.
And the environmental education in Brazil is clearly growing out. But I am worried because sometimes the other generations thinking the little children will change the culture, he will grow up with a new culture, and they will abandon it with a planet in a disaster. So the two things are not linked. To prepare these children and to face the climate change. It's working all the time. And I think the old generations are very important in this moment of changement. We need to touch these people. It's because I think the university is a so important place because it's an intergenerational place where the young people respect the knowledge done by old people, and the old people hope the new people can change the point of view and discover things in the science. So it's a very important place to intergenerational relationships.
Well, I agree that it's very important to have an intergenerational way of working and to use the potential experience of older people with the knowledge of younger people. Unfortunately, very often there are big problems with this, and that young people are very rejecting of older people, blaming older people for doing this. That older people have given the problem to the younger people for them to deal with it. And of course, when younger people are older, the problem will be even worse. And maybe there are some older people who feel, oh, that's okay because I'll be dead, which is terrible. Of course, not many older people would think that consciously. Not many older people would deliberately say that consciously, but maybe that feeling is inside some people unconsciously. You know, oh, it's terrible, but anyway, I won't be there. No. No.
Uma pergunta? Mais alguma questão da gente?
Questões podem ir para outros campos, no campo conceitual, por exemplo, de sujeitos, objetos, de crise, que vocês, né, a gente tem várias cabeças aqui. Nenhuma questão? Não? Tudo bem? Aqui. Uma momento, please, aqui.
Não, assim, mas geral, no final do curso, é isso.
Ok.
So thank you, Julian. I think we can head to a little break.
Encerramos por hoje.
Yeah, so we have no more questions. So Thank you very much, Julian, for this presentation. Round of applause for.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm very happy with the lectures and the other activities because I can see and hear about from my other colleagues, they are making links between the researchers and your approach and the activity. So I think they will multiply our concern with colleagues and scientists.